Cornish Mutual, farming insurance experts.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Farming Focus, the podcast for South West farmers brought to you by Cornish Mutual. I'm your host, Peter Green, and today we're taking a closer look at natural capital and exploring the shifting political and financial landscape when it comes to how we view biodiversity and nature in all its forms on our farms. This episode is about helping you to make sense of change, hopefully uncovering new opportunities and understand the full value of your farm's natural resources. And for reference, this episode is being recorded on the 24th of March 2026, just after the release of DEFRA's long-awaited land use framework. We'll explore how farmers can learn more about natural capital, biodiversity markets and biodiversity net gain, and we'll tackle some of the common barriers to participation. Whether you're curious about new income streams, keen to enhance the sustainability of your farm, or simply want a clearer picture of the opportunities ahead, then this is the opportunity for you. I'm joined by two fantastic guests. First of all, we have Dr. Laura Underdown, who is an agricultural scientist and senior manager in the cereals knowledge transfer team at AHDB and is a current Nuffield scholar in the same year as me, who is exploring the barriers for farmers in emerging biodiversity and nature markets. And then also we have Jonathan Chapman, who, as well as being a vet, farms in Cornwall, running the pedigree Atlantic Angus herd, and was recently named both Beef Farmer of the Year and Environmental Champion of the Year in the 2025 Farmers Weekly Awards. So congratulations, Jonathan. Massive achievement.
Thank you.
Great to have you both here. So, Laura, first of all, welcome to the show. It's great to have you. Could you introduce yourself and your interest in natural capital, please?
Yes, thank you very much for having me. So, as you said, agricultural scientist by training, very much came in from the research side of things, was very interested in ecosystem services, how we make them work on farm, but really got interested in natural capital through, I guess, the massive shift we've seen in kind of policy in the last couple of years in agriculture. We've seen this huge swing from a basic payment scheme, from payment for land area, to payments for ecosystem services, essentially for payments for public goods. And that is a huge shift for the government, but it also comes at a time that farmers are now being asked to deliver food production, climate resilience, all these additional public goods, clean water, clean air, maintaining healthy, nutritious food, all at the forefront of a kind of a climate and biodiversity crisis. So farmers are really being asked to do it all with subsidy being kind of shifted. So I became really interested in, can natural capital fill that gap in any way? Can it be kind of the answer to environmental but also economic resilience for UK farms? And that's where the kind of Nuffield was born and got very interested in natural capital markets.
Very good. Well, we look forward to hearing more about that today, but also with your Nuffield report. That'll be great. So, Jonathan, welcome to you as well. Like I said, great to have you on the show. Could you tell us a bit about yourself, your farm, and how you manage the environment on that farm, please?
Yeah, sure. So, the farm in North Cornwall, near Bude. It's a family farm. We're farming around 850 acres a minute, probably 1/3 rented, 2/3 owned. It's all suckler cows, pedigree Angus suckler cows, which we take through to finish and sell some bulls for breeding. And we've got quite a lot of environmental areas. We're not the schemes, and trying to make the most of all our natural capital, not just producing livestock, but what we can make out of the ground, through subsidy schemes or else.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much. So I think we've heard the term natural capital used sort of about 5 times already. We're only a couple of minutes in. Laura, for those who might be new to the term or have heard it and just don't quite fully understand what it means, I would include myself in that group. Can you just unpack a bit what the term natural capital means and why is it important for farmers to understand it?
Yeah, completely. I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head. The language around some of this stuff is actually quite complex. We all use a different word for the same thing. It gets quite conflated quite easily. So as a very basic standpoint, the natural capital stance is being able to put a pound sign on nature. So you might disagree with whether we should or what that value is, but that's a whole different podcast. The notion is if you put a pound sign on nature, what it allows you to do is get nature on the asset list, get nature on the balance sheet of farm businesses, but also outside agriculture. So it's actually I'll explain the terms in a minute, but a really good opportunity for communicating the value that agriculture brings outside of the agriculture industry. And that's where and the government particularly, are saying these large pots of cash are to be unlocked are outside agriculture in the private sector.
So part of putting a pound sign on it is to add a language that farmers speak to an extent?
Farmers speak, but also everybody across the world speaks.
Okay.
If you can put something on a balance sheet and talk about it in economic terms, you can argue about what that economic term is, but it means that you can communicate it. And nature has been invisible in all of our businesses for a very, very long time. So it really brings in nature as infrastructure and as something you should invest in, something you should build up, like you were alluding to a minute ago. But when it comes to the actual terminology as well, that's where I think there's a lot of confusion. So natural capital in itself is not the markets that we hear about, or the carbon market or a nature market. Natural capital is the stock of environmental resources you have on your farm. So whether that be water, soil, air, biodiversity, the microbes in your soil, your hedges, your trees, it's everything that's physically there that's underpinning your system.
Okay.
So then ecosystem services are the services that are derived from that natural capital. So that there are many, many different types. There's a beautiful wheel. If you Google ecosystem service wheel, you'll see all the different types. But essentially the ones that are critical to food production are, water regulation, nutrient cycling, pollination. All of those are ecosystem services which rely on underpinning like really resilient natural capital. Food production is an ecosystem service. So we often put the two kind of separate. We say, it's, someone's asking me to do something with natural capital or nature. Resilient natural capital means resilient food production. You can't produce food without that underlying natural capital. So it's very much seated within there.
Okay.
You then have nature-based solutions, which is the other terminology, which is how we use ecosystem services to solve societal challenges, whether it be flooding, health, climate resilience. And then you have nature markets, which is the monetization, kind of the measuring of an uplift in one of those services. So it's baselining, measuring, reporting, verifying, creating an improvement or additionality. And that kind of improvement bit means that you can monetize and create a credit. But that's a voluntary action. At this point, you can choose to engage in a market, but what's not voluntary, I would argue, is investing in your underpinning natural infrastructure.
Okay, so that's a really key point there. It's not voluntary, in your opinion, to not invest in your underlying natural capital, the good stuff on your farm. Okay, really interesting. So correct me if I'm wrong. In short, there we've heard kind of a flow diagram. That's how I'm seeing it in my head. 4 things. So you've got the natural capital, which is the nature which allows your farm to do what it does. That might be to produce food. That might be to be engaged in other ecosystem services, which is the second part. And one ecosystem service might be in production of food. Then you get on to nature-based solutions, and those are the goods that we can do. Producing clean air, clean water, locking up carbon on our farms by having a good amount of natural capital. And then you may choose to be involved in nature markets, which can be potentially where we can monetize it. So there's those 4 things. Okay. Really helpful. Thank you. So, Jonathan, all that in mind, we're calling it natural capital here. What I guess it boils down to is that practical application of nature on our farms. Can you talk to us about how you started to make more space for nature on your farm, please?
We haven't got the best land, and there's lots of what you call poorer land, but it's nature rich. It's a traditional sort of Cornish farm. I'm like around 300 hectares, and I've got over 300 fields on the farm.
Right.
I've added up the hedges to I'm claiming some grant on them now, and we've got over 70 kilometres of hedge.
70?
Yeah. And you think the 3 metre wide hedge, 70 kilometres, you're talking, 20 odd hectares of hedge.
That's mad, isn't it?
We've got, huge, we're doing a huge amount for the environment, and it's just, and I'm constantly looking for ways that we can actually value that and get some recognition for it.
Yeah.
So we need support with this because, we're farmers, we're competing on a world market. The Australian farmers, they don't have to worry about hedges. They can drive in one direction for 10 miles of the left turn around. I can't get 100 yards without another hedge. Yeah, and they're not even in straight lines or anything like that. And, we're farming, with Iron Age field, structures. Something competing in the current world. Yeah, we've got a lot of environmental features on the farm. Yeah, we've got culm grassland, and some of that's priority habitat, and some of that we're trying to get into priority habitat. So, because there has been some funding through the SFI for that.
Yeah.
We probably started with countryside stewardship was probably the original thing we did. That became mid-tier schemes and now SFI schemes. Yeah, we do a lot for the environment, but we need some sort of support for what we're doing. Because there is as a business, there's quite a lot of risk with some of the things we do on these things. They could, expense, not just like, maintaining hedges and hedgerows and those sort of things, but, if I'm planting a herbal ley, which I've got 200 hectares of herbal ley now, so 2/3 of the farm is herbal ley, but you're at risk of like, if it fails when you sow it, you've got to reseed it, and more expensive seeds. You haven't grown on your farm before. There's a lot of risk there, which is why we've, utilized the SFI scheme when it was available to develop that. But I can definitely see the benefits are accruing from what we've been doing and to the soil and what we've done through these schemes. Just a bit troubled about what the future is with that.
Yeah, I don't think you're alone in feeling that. Really interesting to hear you started your answer there about the global market that we're operating in. And that was something which really struck me when I flew out to New Zealand last year. We flew from Heathrow. Within an hour of Heathrow, you've gone over around 100 million people in terms of population. We are a small country and neighboured by some smallish countries in the Netherlands and places like that. But then we took, I think, 6 hours to fly over Russia, and we were speaking to Nuffield scholars in New Zealand, from Australia, from Brazil, where I've just been. We've got a Nuffield scholar from Canada at the moment, and in Canada, we know another Nuffield scholar who's got a train station on her farm to take her grain away. That commodity market that people are operating in is completely different from our context. It's really important that you've set the scene, saying you've got 300 fields and they're about a hectare each in size on average. And really interesting to hear you say about seeing the benefits. Can I ask you to expand a bit on that? So how would you say you're seeing the benefits? Is it in yield? Is it on establishment? Is it nature? There's more birds?
Yeah. Probably a couple of things. The home farm is very heavy, wet clay. I've been quite conscious of trying to improve the infiltration of our soil. Very often it will cap off in the top couple of inches, and you dig a hole, you see the grass roots only go down so far.
Yeah.
So that's why probably what got me interested in the herbal lays is to try and get the roots diving deeper into the soil, because a time or two, like, it's been soaking wet, and you dig a hole and the soil is so wet in the top 2 inches, and then get down 6 inches, it can be dry. And it's just trying to improve that soil through natural means, rather than going in with a machine, trying to get that happening. And we are starting to see that coming through now, but I've been growing herbal lays now 5-6 years, and it is probably taken all of that to really start to see a difference coming through.
Right.
We've reduced ploughing, but I still plough at times because it does help, get air into the soil for a reseed at times. If we've done drainage work, we need to do that. But yeah, we definitely, the mixed species swards, adding in certain herbs into that, your plantain, your chicory,
deep rooting ones
in there. Yeah. And just trying to get through not disturbing the soil so much, and with rotation grazing, those sort of things we're allowing the plants to fully establish themselves and express themselves and getting the deeper roots going on.
Yeah.
We're seeing benefits from that.
Really interesting to hear that you started doing it because there was a need, not because there was a pot of money. And I think that's something we spoke to Sabine McEwen from FWAG and the Gills in series 1 of the Farming Focus podcast, and well worth people going back to that episode and listening to it. And the advice then, as it is now, is very much don't let the tail wag the dog. Do things on your farm because it actually works and it's the right thing for the farm, not because there's a pot of money for it. And so, Laura, since Brexit and that transition away from basic payments, which you alluded to in your first answer, it feels like farmers have been told to look at alternative income streams. And probably before that, I think even in the 1990s, we were being told to diversify. They're certainly down here in Cornwall. How does natural capital tie into financial incentives, but also wider policy changes? So you spoke to us a little bit about, that flow of 4 different stages, and we ended up at nature markets. But, also with wider policy changes, how does that come into it?
Yeah, I think what you just said is really important, that they're has been a clear direction of travel for quite a long time. It's just all kind of come to a head. And so if you look at, so if you were saying the 1990s, but the Climate Change Act, I think it was like 2008, we had the Environment Act, which is like 2021, I believe. So all of those things enshrined in law a lot of the kind of actions that we're now being asked to do to meet those targets for the government. So in the Climate Change Act, that's where you get your carbon budgets from. That's where the net zero by 2050 goal came from. So that's all enshrined in law.
So that's the context.
It's a legally binding target for the government. And then nature became much more prominent in the Environment Act, where we got the 30 by 30 targets, which is, 30% of land and sea protected by 2030. There's also, that's where BNG was actually introduced. It didn't come in until 2024, but that's where the notion of BNG kind of came in. So all of these things, it's been a long-term kind of shift.
Yeah.
But we're only kind of seeing, I guess, the agricultural policy stuff happen as a delivery mechanism. So it's been the government needs this to happen by then. Who manages 70% of the UK's land?
Yeah.
Farmers and land managers. They can't achieve it without you. Yeah. And so quite simply, it becomes the most effective delivery mechanism is changing on-farm behaviour. I would argue everything you've just illustrated absolutely makes sense for on-farm as well, why it builds that resilience, and we do need that. But I do think there should be fair payment for those extra public goods and services if they're to meet targets that somebody else has set, essentially.
Yeah. Okay. Brilliant. So really helpful to have that context and show that it's been a direction of travel from successive governments, and that actually they really do need farmers in order to achieve these targets. Coming now to biodiversity net gain, or BNG as it's commonly known, in really simple terms, what is it and how does it work? And I guess one question that I particularly have on this is you hear the term additionality quite a lot. Yeah. How does that come into it? So I appreciate it's not something you can necessarily get into a very short answer, but as simply as you can, please.
So biodiversity net gain in simple terms is it came in as a change, an additional kind of change to like the Town and Planning Act that was in that Environment Act piece. That when you're doing a planning or development, so housing, infrastructure, you have to create a 10% uplift. So if you've got, this is your square footage of what you've created and the housing you've put in, you can't just come back to what was there beforehand. You need to come back to what was there beforehand plus a minimum of 10%. So you need to achieve this uplift. So there is a whole mitigation hierarchy behind all of this, and that kind of is where the supply and demand comes in with farming. But the notion is that if you can achieve your mitigation inside that red line boundary of that development, that 10%, you should try and do that first. You should then, if you can't achieve it in that red line boundary, then you would look at, can I pay somebody to create that additionality, which creates a credit that I can buy. But it's a 30-year agreement, so these are long-term things. You have to manage and achieve that uplift by the end of that 30-year period.
Okay.
So the notion is very much baseline, what was there beforehand. You do your development. You understand where your new degraded baseline essentially is. You then have to achieve 10% above that original baseline.
Okay. So
that's the credit idea.
Like real layman's terms, I'm going to oversimplify this.
Yeah.
How much nature did we have before we started a given development? When we put that development into effect, how much nature do we have? So then what do we need to do to bridge that gap from the amount of nature we have after the development to plus 10% of what we had in the first place? And when we talk about mitigation, really what we mean is we're making up for what we've got rid of.
Offsetting.
Yeah, in that development. Okay. Great. Thank you. So thinking broadly and maybe illustrating the point with some of your experiences from your Nuffield travels, what opportunities do biodiversity markets for farmers, what do they present, both environmentally but also financially?
The changing climate is a massive one, and that's what particularly we've seen through, I went to Southeast Asia, I went to New Zealand as well, and a lot of Europe. We're at this kind of inflection point where we're about to potentially drop off a bit of a cliff. And that might
not to be too dramatic.
Not to be scary. But, it takes a long time to build up this resilience on farm. You've seen 5-6 years
Jonathan,
to build that up. Natural systems take a long time to degrade. They take a long time to build back up. So we're kind of at this point, and I'd recommend there's a lot of interesting reports the government's just released on the impact of continuing biodiversity decline on UK national security. But we're at this kind of inflection point where we've kind of been using that natural infrastructure and not been reinvesting into it necessarily for quite a long time.
Okay.
There's reasons for that. We haven't got time today, but we need to start building that back up. So it's, can we use some of these finance pots? And we touched on additionality, but I know that's a big problem with, if you've been farming really well, actually, and you have been building it back up, your baseline is pretty high now.
Yeah.
Where can we access some schemes that don't require additionality? So SFI, love it, loathe it, who knows? It's not actually an additionality market. It's saying, I'll pay you for putting in for having those hedgerows that you've already got. So are there markets where you can be paid for the good you're already doing? And that's what a lot of supply chain premium markets I've seen around the world are doing.
Sorry, an example of that would be a retailer here.
Yes, Tesco, M&S, not the consumer more necessarily, but pays you as the farmer a premium for doing this list of what they consider environmentally friendly actions, because it's absolutely in their interest to build resilience and less risk into their supply chain.
So really important point. It's in the interests of third parties, such as the retailers. Why?
So this is a lot of what I saw in Europe, particularly when traveling, is so we have this thing called the Task Force for Climate Disclosures and the Task Force for Nature Disclosures. The carbon one has come into force already. Nature might come into force in the next few years. We don't really know. But that requires everybody, so your Tesco's, your Rabobanks, your agricultural banks, everyone in the supply chain to be reporting carbon in the case of the carbon disclosures ones, but carbon footprint and nature footprint when that comes into force potentially. So what they do is they go, if I'm Tesco or a big supermarket, everybody who supplies me is my carbon and nature footprint. So it's absolutely in their interest to reduce that footprint at the farm level. It's also from a risk point of view massive. If you're an agricultural bank, you really want the people you lend to still be here in 20 years to pay you back. So
that's the nub.
That's the nub. So it makes, I think actually corporates and the supply chain side are seeing this as a huge risk. If we can't have environmentally resilient farms, then they're not going to be here in 10, 15 years. And they're not going to be able to therefore create that resilient supply chain and that resilient lending profile.
Can you say that again? Without environmentally resilient farms?
It's a business critical strategy. Environmentally resilient farms are a business critical strategy everywhere up the supply chain.
Yeah.
And I do count that as for ourselves as well at the bottom end.
Yeah.
But there's an absolute reason why the supply chain and government and banks want to incentivize this shift. Yeah. And that's why we're seeing a lot of those, not just the natural capital markets like the statutory markets like BNG, but we're seeing these supply chain premiums. We're seeing water companies be interested. We're seeing all of this kind of movement.
And is this above the Scope 3 emissions thing as well?
Yeah, so Scope 3 fits into that Task Force for Climate Disclosures. That's where that comes from, is they are reporting on what you're doing. And the numbers we can argue about, because I don't think the numbers are always correct. I think farming shows up as a big red X often when it's not. Hence why there's lots of baselining pilots going on and like AHDB doing the carbon one.
And just lots of calculators.
And lots of calculators. It's trying to get true accounting of how can we see where we actually are rather than using international averages that say, we're all as bad as each other because we love it's the how, not the cow sort of situation. That's absolutely true. But we are showing up as a big red X and a big risk to a lot of people.
So, Jonathan, you're hearing this. You have known some of this. You might have known all of it. How does it make you feel to hear this? So I guess there's an element about how important farmers are. There's the element about, do the powers that be, for want of a better phrase, really understand what we can do, and are we all being tarred with the same brush? How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, from my point of view, with some of the suppliers, there seems to be quite a bit of box ticking going on at the minute, and I'm yet to see long-term contracts come out of any of them. A sucker cow producer, if I bull a cow today, I'm not selling it for 2.5, 3 years time. Yeah. But I don't know what I'm going to pay for my beef next week. Yeah. I'd like to see it coming, because I do feel we're doing a lot here, for everything, not just producing, beef, we look after the environment and everything else. So I'd like to see recognition of that. And there's been a lot of talk about the, Scope 3 emissions and sustainability and that. But at the end of the day, so far, just price seems to be the thing. And in the minute that they think there's an oversupply on cattle, they'll drop the price of them. Yeah. If they can knock 5-10p a kilo off dead weight, they'll do it, like that, straight away. I haven't seen this long-term change, long-term contracts, anything longer term. And there are a lot of warm words and very few actions.
And is that what we need to see? So longer term contracts from buyers and things like that? Would that give farmers the confidence, do you think?
Yeah, I think, because like we talked about, like a lot of these things, they're long-term actions, you don't see it straight away.
Yeah.
Yes, if I've been 3 years, I mean, that's nothing, but it just makes you short-term in what you're doing, just herbal lays, 3-year term. Well, do you put a proper one in, or do you just oversee the bit and get the box and get some money? Whereas if it's a 5-10 year agreement, you can actually look further ahead and plan long-term.
And this comes back to wider criticisms within the industry that we've been seeing for years, but it feels to me like particularly for the last 12 months. So like I said, we're recording this end of March 2026. We were hearing in the last days of Stephen Reed as DEFRA secretary that we needed to be running our businesses like that, like businesses. And Emma Reynolds, since she's come in, she's been talking more like she understands that we need to have a bit more certainty to invest, but it is definitely something that farmers need. Thinking about what farmers need, and particularly those small farms, Laura, DEFRA said in their recent SFI announcement that a smaller farm is around 50 hectares or smaller. Nationally, I understand why they've done that, but there's many farms of around that size in the southwest. That's my farm, 50 hectares basically. How can farms like that, or ones with limited resources, whether that's time, money, whatever, get started with natural capital and making those improvements?
Yeah, exactly what we've just said here is how do you get that risk, that long-term risk bit and that transition bit to look longer? How can you afford to look further ahead? And I think small farms particularly, what we've seen with early biodiversity markets, I think particularly, is those that have the resource, maybe the larger land holdings. You can use that kind of economy of scale bit to afford the advisors. You can upfront the resource costs needed. These are quite expensive schemes sometimes to baseline to get all of that data you would need to know where you're at. So I think if you're a smaller farm, what I've seen, the best thing I've seen collectively in this country and others is that collaborative action. Can you come together as a cluster? Can you come together and a cluster doesn't have to be an absolutely huge like landscape recovery project, although they are doing fantastic things. It could be, 6 or 7 of you working together to pay one ecologist to be able to baseline your farms. It's how can you get what you need to then potentially enter some of these markets, but at a lower resource to entry cost. I think the risk bit is massive though. I think the risk needs to be better shared across the supply chain. We need to get more value in that value chain down to farms to be able to look further ahead. And I do think that the supply chain should be taking on some of that transition risk more than just tick box actions by saying, we will upfront you for 5 years, maybe it'd be 7 years, so that we believe you will get to this point and we're giving you a good chance to do it, rather than just to do this list of environmental actions. So I do think collaborative action and coming together to try and lower the point of entry and to look what you want for your businesses. If you really need better infiltration rates, you have, you flood every year, you've got an area that's a problem. What do your businesses in your area need? And how can you present that solution to be funded? And that does take some real resource, like some middlemen thinking almost.
But that feels a lot more like it requires farmers to be on the front foot, to be proactive, to be positive in how they're approaching the situation, rather than saying what schemes are out there. I need herbal aid. Actually, I can get paid for that. I'll do that.
Yeah.
Okay. So with that in mind, Jonathan, I talked about Emma Reynolds just a moment ago, who's now the Secretary of State at the Department for the Environment. It feels to me like we've seen more sort of conciliatory government rhetoric since she's been in that post. We've also had the Baroness Batter's profitability review, and the land use framework has recently been announced. So perhaps with these in mind, and thinking about what Laura just said about maybe the supply chain sort of taking a little bit more of the slack, can you see a time when maybe we don't have the government-led environmental schemes that, they have just they have completely gone, and actually there's maybe more private financing?
I can see a time with no government funding. I'm not sure I can see the private funding coming on at the same time for us. Like, look at the B&G at the minute, most of that B&G has gone to big estates. Because you got like a 30-year tie-in, your land value just falls off a cliff. It's 30-year tie-in, but it's going to end up at a priority habitat, so you're not going to be able to farm it again. I just can't see how family farms can do these actions, really. other than, maybe if you work together with a load of other farmers, you can get some small areas in. But as everyone knows, trying to get farmers to work together is an absolute nightmare.
Yeah. I think, Laura, you've seen a bit of that. So what then, Jonathan, is the message to policymakers? You said you can see a time when we maybe don't have that government funding, but if you could speak to Emma Reynolds right now, or any of the guys that are in DEFRA or Natural England who are pushing that policy, what would you say to them about that future regarding environmental payments and schemes?
Without that money behind what we're doing, I can't do it. Business got to pay bills, and I like what we've done for the environment, but I've got to make ends meet, and things will have to change. And if we're literally just going to compete in the world market, we've got to farm like it.
Yeah.
And we've got to farm every acre if we're doing that. You've got to put it into context. There's various wars going on at the minute. Food security is a big issue. Maybe we should be farming like that. That's the other thing.
And that's a whole other podcast. We're going to have to come back to that one. Okay. So government need to understand that if we're going to compete, then they really need to think about the context in which we're competing. That's what it feels like we're hearing. Laura,
I think asking us to compete with those large-scale commodity markets is unfair. I don't think on scale environmental offsetting, we're just shipping the environmental problem elsewhere if we're doing that. I think if we're going to end up in a world, and we don't know, without public subsidy, we need some support to get to a point where the business is resilient enough, has been able to make that transition, so that the benefits of making nature work for you are returning that actual profit bit. And we're not very good at communicating that. It's kind of the unseen costs, and we're scared of the unknown, but actually the known is blooming scary. And that's what a farmer I spoke to recently said, not blooming, he swore ferociously.
Well, it's a family show.
It's a family show. But when you're completely right, that's the option you're given. But actually, because we can't see what the unknown is and the cost of continuing to degrade that nature, you are degrading productivity with that. And that's in no one's best interest. So farming to the nth degree to maximise yield isn't the answer, but we have to look at the externalities bit. Even if you didn't care about nature, which I know you absolutely do, if you were looking at just the Iran war, like you said, and the cost of FERT and the cost of oil and gas and all of that, if you can create a system where you are less reliant on public funding, you are less reliant on externalities, that does benefit your bottom line, and that doesn't come from just looking at yield. And I think that's the trap we've kind of fallen into, is if you don't have these ecosystem services on the balance sheet, they're invisible, you can't see them, you're not costing them in, because we don't have the data very easily to do that.
So really simply, your contention is by valuing natural capital, but just valuing nature and understanding the resilience that it can offer our farming system to make sure we keep doing what we want to do, whether that's food production, whether that's benefiting from a BNG scheme, that's the starting point. That's what we need to be doing.
It's vital. If you never touch a BNG scheme in your life, it's vital for food production to continue, let alone to build its productivity.
With that in mind, final two questions. So Laura, for you, where do you see the future of environmental schemes, natural capital, BNG, environmental markets, nature markets, call them what you will? Where do you see them going, in the broadest sense?
I don't think they're going away because of that policy compliance regulatory baseline bit. That is only going to get higher for all industry. Everybody's reporting. So the direction of travel is clear, is set. I don't think we're swinging back from this. I think the opportunity is how can we shape it for farming in this kind of golden window where there is some public funding. We might not like it, it might not be enough, but what if there isn't?
Might not feel very golden.
It might not feel golden, but what if it is? And how do we get that private finance unlocked quicker? By showing people what we can achieve on farmland. And I do think there's a big bit there between, there's plenty of people, you're doing fantastic things already. This isn't necessarily about doing more. It's about how can we get the data and the value to be better demonstrated and therefore pull in some private finance. So I don't think they're going away, which is probably not what everybody wants to hear. Direction of travel is clear, but it's multifunctional land use. I don't think we should be stopping food production for this. We should be using that 5-10% of land on your farm that actually drives a loss every year. If you really looked at it on average over the last 10 years, where are you losing money? And how can you bring in a different income stream to prop that up? And use it as stacking income, not as taking away income. Nobody should be stopping, in my opinion, food production. This isn't about do that or that. It's how can we make it work to give your business more resilience, more income, and multifunctional land use rather than trees are there, crops there.
Yeah. And this enterprise stacking concept is definitely something which the land use framework has alluded to. It's something that we spoke to David Oates and Tim May about on the Farming Focus podcast a year or so ago. So do go back and listen to that one as well. Thank you, Laura. So we need to take advantage of what's there now. Jonathan, final question for you. What can farmers and land managers do to make sure they're on the front foot, as we spoke about earlier, to make sure that their business and the farm environment that they're managing is in the best place for future?
So as we've done this bit, we're part of the AHDB's environmental baselining. So we're trying to get a baseline of where we are now to understand, what we had potentially got to sell or, make most of in the future. So I recommend that with all these schemes that are available. I think, looking at that porous land and other options for it. There may be trees, it may be going to some of the other schemes, but you really look at the poor ground.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you. So it's having that resolution and really critically thinking about every part of your farm. Great conversation. Thank you ever so much, guys. My head is buzzing with takeaways from that. But it's been really good to chat to you both.
Cornish Mutual, farming insurance experts.
So it's time now for the showstoppers. This is a bittersweet point in every show for me because I have to try and condense down what's been an absolutely brilliant conversation in just a few points. I think the first thing that really strikes me from our conversation is that there has to be a recognition that we all need natural capital. We all have natural capital on our farms. Laura talked about food production. The one thing which most farmers really identify as doing being an ecosystem service. And for that ecosystem service, we need to have natural capital on our farms. So we have to take this seriously. So the next point here is around risk. There's a huge risk potentially to other parties in the supply chain, our buyers, the retailers that sell our product, but also to government who have got these targets, which we heard about from Laura. In this, there is a real opportunity to farmers to mitigate that risk. We need to understand that there is a real value in farmers and UK agriculture at large in helping these third parties to mitigate the risks that are posed by not having sufficient natural capital. But finally, and this is probably the bottom line for me, it's around time. Jonathan gave us that beautiful illustration of how there was a need on his farm to get through the clay pan. And that's why he started introducing herbal leys with their deeper rooting characteristics. It took time, but he saw the benefits. And that really is the bottom line here. It will take time, but we need to embark on a direction of travel. Natural systems, we heard, take time to degrade, but also to build. So we can't delay. We've got to get on with it. And we've got to really engage with natural capital.
Cornish Mutual, farming insurance experts.
That's it for today's episode. A massive thank you to my guests, to Jonathan Chapman and to Dr. Laura Underdown. Join us next week for a bonus episode when we'll be looking at the lessons that farmers can learn from participating in environmental schemes, what works, what doesn't, and how to make the most of the opportunities to improve the farm environment. We would love to hear from you with any feedback that you have about the podcast, any questions, suggestions. So do send us an email to podcast@cornishmutual.co.uk. Check out the show notes for more information on today's show, including the link to our podcast disclaimer. You've been listening to Farming Focus, brought to you by Cornish Mutual. I've been your host, Peter Green, and until next time, it's goodbye from me and everyone in the Cornish Mutual podcast team.
Cornish Mutual, farming insurance experts.